Number 1. Ronald James Ward Jr. There's something particularly terrifying about a killer who doesn't stay in one place. When someone commits crimes in a single area, investigators can focus their resources, connect patterns, and build a profile. But when the crimes span multiple states, crossing jurisdictional boundaries, and leaving a trail of victims in different communities, the investigation becomes exponentially more difficult. That's exactly what law enforcement faced in the year 2000 when Ronald James Ward Jr. embarked on a cross-country killing spree that would ultimately claim at least 4 lives. Ward wasn't from any one place, or rather, he chose not to stay in any one place. His background remains somewhat murky, but what's clear is that by 2000, he was moving through multiple states with deadly intent. The killing spree began in August 2000, and over the next 4 months, Ward would commit acts of violence in Montana, Arkansas, and California. 4 confirmed victims, thousands of miles apart, each one representing a life cut short by violence. The victims themselves varied: different ages, different backgrounds, different circumstances. But they all had one thing in common. They crossed paths with Ronald James Ward Jr. at the wrong time. For investigators, cases like this are nightmares. Each state has its own law enforcement agencies, its own databases, its own procedures. Communication between jurisdictions can be slow. Evidence from Montana might not immediately be compared with evidence from Arkansas or California. Ward was counting on that fragmentation to keep him one step ahead. He moved from state to state, leaving bodies in his wake, and for a time, it seemed like he might get away with it. But modern forensic science has a way of catching up with killers, no matter how careful they think they're being. DNA evidence became the key to unraveling Ward's crimes. At each crime scene, microscopic traces of biological material were collected: a hair, a drop of blood, skin cells. These samples were processed and entered into databases, and slowly, patterns began to emerge. The same DNA profile started showing up at multiple crime scenes in multiple states. Suddenly, what looked like separate, unconnected incidents revealed themselves as the work of a single individual. Law enforcement agencies began coordinating, sharing information, building a comprehensive picture of Ward's movements and his victims. When Ward was finally apprehended, the case against him was built on that DNA evidence. Prosecutors from multiple states worked together to ensure he faced justice for each of his crimes. The defense tried to challenge the DNA evidence, to question the collection procedures, to suggest contamination or mistakes. But forensic science had advanced to the point where the evidence was ironclad. The DNA didn't lie. Ward's genetic signature was present at multiple crime scenes, connecting him definitively to the victims. The trial resulted in convictions, and Ward was sentenced to serve time for his crimes. He entered the prison system knowing he would likely never leave it, and he didn't. Ronald James Ward Jr. died in prison in 2014, bringing a final end to a story that had spanned multiple states and destroyed multiple families. His death meant there would be no parole hearings, no possibility of release, no chance for him to harm anyone else. Ward's case stands as a testament to the importance of DNA databases and interstate cooperation in law enforcement. Without those tools, he might have remained free much longer and might have claimed more victims. His cross-country activities also highlight a disturbing reality. In our mobile society, where people can drive from state to state with ease, killers can exploit jurisdictional boundaries to evade capture. It's only through coordinated efforts and advanced forensic technology that we can hope to stop them. And even then, the question lingers. How many others like Ward are out there right now, moving through the country, leaving destruction in their wake? Number 2. Saeed Hanai. Some killers operate in the shadows, trying to avoid attention at all costs. Others commit their crimes with a twisted sense of righteousness, believing they're somehow doing society a favor. Saeed Haniyeh fell into the latter category, and his reign of terror in Iran, beginning in 2000, would earn him one of the most chilling nicknames in criminal history, the Spider Killer. Haniyeh lived in the holy city of Mashhad, Iran, a place of pilgrimage, religious devotion, and deep cultural traditions. He was married, had children, and to the outside world seemed like an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He'd served in the Iran-Iraq War during the 1980s, an experience that left lasting impacts on his psyche. He worked as a construction worker, supporting his family through manual labor. But inside his mind, something dark was taking shape. Haniyeh developed a twisted ideology that would justify unspeakable violence. He became convinced that certain women, specifically those working in activities he deemed immoral, were corrupting society and needed to be eliminated. In his warped worldview, he wasn't committing crimes. He was cleaning the streets, performing a service. His methodology was as calculated as it was horrifying. Haniyeh would patrol the streets of Mashhad on his motorcycle, looking for potential victims. When he identified a target, he would pose as a client, luring the women with the promise of money. He'd bring them to his home under false pretenses, and there, in the privacy of his own space, he would end their lives. The nickname Spider Killer came from his method. Like a spider luring prey into its web, Haniyeh used deception to trap his victims before striking. The killing spree began in 2000 and continued into 2001. Body after body was discovered, each one a woman who'd been working the streets of Mashhad. The pattern was unmistakable, and panic spread through the community. Women who worked in this vulnerable profession knew they were being hunted, but economic desperation often left them with few choices. Law enforcement launched an intensive investigation, but Haniyeh was careful. He varied his methods slightly, avoided leaving obvious evidence, and continued his deadly work. Estimates of his victim count vary, but most sources place the number between 16 and 19 women eliminated over the course of approximately a year. 16 to 19 lives ended. 16 to 19 families devastated, all because one man decided he had the right to be judge, jury, and executioner. The magnitude of the crimes eventually drew national attention. The pressure on law enforcement intensified, and investigators worked around the clock to identify the killer. In 2001, Haniyeh's luck finally ran out. Through a combination of witness statements, forensic evidence, and good old-fashioned detective work, authorities identified him as the suspect. When they arrested him, the evidence linking him to the acts was overwhelming. During interrogation, Haniyeh didn't show remorse. Instead, he justified his actions, explaining his twisted reasoning, insisting he'd done nothing wrong. He even claimed he'd done society a favor by removing what he saw as corrupting influences. Some reports suggest he believed he'd receive public support for his actions. The trial was swift and heavily publicized. Given the number of victims, the premeditation involved, and the shocking nature of the crimes, the outcome was almost inevitable. Haniyeh was convicted of multiple counts and sentenced to death. In Iran's legal system, execution for such crimes is not uncommon, and Haniyeh's case was clear-cut. He was executed in 2002, bringing an end to one of Iran's most notorious serial killer cases. But Haniyeh's story doesn't end with his execution. His case sparked conversations about vigilantism, about societal treatment of vulnerable populations, about how ideology can warp a person's moral compass so completely that they come to view violence as righteous. The women he targeted weren't statistics or symbols. They were human beings with hopes, fears, families, and dreams. Yet in Haniyeh's eyes, They were nothing more than problems to be solved. His legacy is a dark reminder that the most dangerous criminals are sometimes those who believe they're heroes. Number 3, Maury Troy Travis. The early 2000s marked a turning point in criminal history. The internet was becoming mainstream, home video technology was widely accessible, and digital trails were beginning to play crucial roles in investigations. Maury Troy Travis embodied this new era of crime in the most disturbing way possible. His activities, which began in 2000, would reveal the dark potential of technology in the hands of a predator. Travis lived in Ferguson, Missouri, in the St. Louis area. Born in 1965, he grew up in what appeared to be a normal environment. On the surface, he seemed unremarkable, just another person navigating life in suburban America. He worked various jobs, including as a waiter, and lived with his mother for periods of time. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something monstrous. Travis had dark fantasies, and unlike many people who keep such thoughts locked away, he decided to act on them. Beginning in 2000, he began targeting vulnerable women, many of whom were individuals struggling with addiction or working in dangerous professions. These were people society often overlooks, which made them perfect victims for someone who wanted to operate undetected. What set Travis apart from many killers was his desire to document his crimes. He didn't just commit these acts and move on. He recorded them. Using video equipment, he captured the terror of his victims, creating footage that would later become crucial evidence in the investigation. This wasn't about simply taking lives. This was about power, control, and the ability to relive the crimes again and again. The recordings showed a level of calculated cruelty that chilled even seasoned investigators. He'd converted a basement area of his home into a torture chamber, soundproofed and equipped with restraints. Travis's victims numbered in the dozens according to his own claims, though only a portion could be officially confirmed. Each victim represented someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. They disappeared from the streets of St. Louis, and while some were reported missing, others simply vanished without anyone noticing. It's a sobering reminder of how certain populations are more vulnerable to predators precisely because their absence doesn't trigger immediate alarm bells. The investigation that eventually caught Travis was helped significantly by technology, the same technology he'd used to document his crimes. Travis had been sending taunting letters to news outlets and the Post-Dispatch newspaper, and in one instance, he sent a map showing the location of a body. But he made a critical mistake. The map was printed from Expedia.com, and that website retained data about who had accessed specific information. Investigators were able to trace the access back to Travis's computer through his internet service provider. It was a digital breadcrumb trail that led right to his door. When police closed in June 2002, they searched Travis's home and found the horrifying video recordings he'd made. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Travis was arrested and faced multiple charges. The prosecution had physical evidence, video evidence, and digital evidence linking him directly to the crimes. There was no ambiguity, no room for reasonable doubt. Investigators also found driver's licenses and other identification belonging to missing women. But Travis never faced trial. While being held in custody at St. Louis County Jail on June 10, 2002, he took his own life. He used bed sheets to hang himself in his cell, ending his own life before the legal system could fully process his case. His death meant that many questions would remain unanswered. Investigators believe he was responsible for many more deaths than the ones they could officially confirm. But without his testimony and cooperation, the full extent of his crimes may never be known. Travis's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how technology can be weaponized by criminals. His recordings weren't just evidence. They were trophies, proof of his power over his victims. And his eventual capture, facilitated by digital tracking, showed that technology can be a double-edged sword. While it gave him new tools for committing and documenting crimes, it also created digital footprints that ultimately led to his identification. In the years since his death, his case has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals trying to understand the mind of someone capable of such systematic cruelty. Number 4. Philip Smith Birmingham, England, in the year 2000, seemed like any other modern city, bustling with activity, full of people going about their daily lives, a place where you could disappear into the crowd if you wanted to. And that's exactly what Philip Smith was counting on. Because while the city hummed with normalcy, Smith was hiding a dark secret that would eventually shock the entire nation. Philip Smith wasn't someone who immediately stood out. Born in 1965, he lived in the Sparkhill area of Birmingham. He worked as a fairground worker and was known in his local area, but he didn't draw particular attention to himself. He had previous convictions for minor offenses, but nothing that would mark him as the dangerous predator he would become. Smith lived a transient lifestyle, moving between temporary accommodations, which gave him a certain invisibility. He could come and go without raising suspicion, without neighbors keeping track of his movements. In 2000, 3 women disappeared from the streets of Birmingham under mysterious circumstances. These weren't random disappearances spread across different neighborhoods. They followed a pattern. The women were all vulnerable in similar ways, all living on the margins of society where their absence might not immediately trigger widespread alarm. Jody Hyde, Rosemary Corcoran, and Carol Jordan, 3 names that would become forever linked to one of Birmingham's most disturbing criminal cases. Each woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind worried families and investigators with few leads. The investigation moved slowly at first. Missing persons cases, especially involving adults with complicated lives, can be difficult to pursue. People sometimes leave voluntarily, sometimes want to be off the grid, sometimes are running from their own problems. But as time passed and the women didn't resurface, investigators began to suspect something more sinister. They started looking for connections between the cases, searching for patterns in the victims' last known locations and activities. The breakthrough came in November 2000, when Smith's landlady made a horrifying discovery. She entered his apartment in Barford Road and found human remains. The scene was beyond disturbing. Body parts had been dismembered and stored in various locations throughout the residence. The landlady immediately contacted police, and what followed was one of the most intensive forensic investigations in Birmingham's history. As investigators processed the scene, they realized they were dealing with multiple victims. When Smith was arrested, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic analysis identified the remains as belonging to the 3 missing women. All had been staying at the same hostel where Smith had lived, which is how he'd gained access to them. The investigation revealed that Smith had befriended these vulnerable women, gained their trust, and then brought them to his apartment where he ended their lives. The dismemberment suggested a level of cold calculation that went beyond even typical violence. The trial in 2001 laid bare the full horror of Smith's crimes. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness testimonies from people who'd seen the victims with Smith, and the undeniable physical evidence found in his apartment. The defense struggled to mount any credible response. How do you explain away human remains in your residence? The jury heard testimony about each victim, about who they were before they met Smith, about the lives cut short by his violence. Philip Smith was convicted of 3 counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge recommended that he serve a minimum of 25 years before being eligible for parole, though many believed he should never be released. The families of his victims finally had answers, though those answers brought little comfort. Their loved ones hadn't just disappeared. They'd been targeted by a predator who saw their vulnerability as an opportunity. Smith remains in prison today, serving his life sentence. His case highlighted the particular vulnerability of people living in temporary accommodation and on society's margins. Individuals who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearances might not trigger instant alarm. It raised uncomfortable questions about how we protect the most vulnerable members of our communities and whether we do enough to notice when they go missing. The 3 women Smith targeted deserved better. Better protection, better attention, better justice. And while he was eventually caught and punished, those lives can never be restored. Number 5. Vicki Dawn Jackson hospitals are supposed to be places of healing. When you or someone you love is sick, you go there seeking help, trusting that the doctors and nurses have your best interests at heart. But what happens when that trust is betrayed? What happens when a healthcare professional uses their access and knowledge not to heal, but to harm? That's exactly what occurred in Texas in the year 2000, when a nurse named Vicki Dawn Jackson turned her position of trust into an opportunity for unspeakable acts. Jackson worked at Nocona General Hospital in Texas, a small facility serving a rural community in the northern part of the state. She was a licensed vocational nurse, someone who'd been trained to provide care and comfort to patients in their most vulnerable moments. She'd been working in healthcare for years and had built a reputation among colleagues. Patients had no reason to suspect anything sinister. To the outside world, she was just another dedicated healthcare professional doing difficult work in a small-town hospital. But beginning in 2000, Jackson began using her position to commit horrifying acts. Her weapon of choice was a paralytic drug, substances designed to temporarily immobilize patients during medical procedures. Specifically, she used Mivacron, a neuromuscular blocking agent. In the right hands and proper doses, these drugs serve important medical purposes. In Jackson's hands, they became instruments of death. The drugs caused respiratory failure, essentially suffocating victims from the inside while leaving them conscious and aware of what was happening. The victims were patients under her care, people who were already sick, already vulnerable, already dependent on medical staff for their survival. Jackson would administer doses of paralytic drugs without medical justification, causing the patients to stop breathing. Because these were individuals who were already in poor health, their deaths might have been attributed to their underlying conditions if not for one crucial factor. They all died under suspiciously similar circumstances, and they all died when Jackson was on duty. The pattern eventually caught the attention of hospital administrators and law enforcement. Medical professionals began reviewing patient records, examining the circumstances of unexpected deaths, and a disturbing picture emerged. There were too many deaths occurring too close together, all involving patients under Jackson's care. The statistical probability of this being coincidence was virtually zero. An investigation was launched in late 2000, and forensic toxicologists examined the victims' remains. They found traces of the paralytic drugs in levels that couldn't be explained by legitimate medical procedures. Investigators identified several victims, but focused primarily on 4 cases where the evidence was strongest. The victims included elderly patients who'd been admitted for relatively routine care, but who died unexpectedly. Families who'd trusted the hospital with their loved ones were devastated to learn that those deaths hadn't been natural, hadn't been inevitable, but had been deliberately caused by someone they'd trusted. When confronted with the evidence, Jackson's defense crumbled. The prosecution built a case showing that she'd deliberately administered substances to multiple patients, knowing full well what the outcome would be. The motive remained somewhat unclear. Was it a twisted sense of mercy? A desire for power and control? Simple malice? Boredom? Jackson never provided a satisfactory explanation. What was clear was that she'd violated every oath and ethical principle of the nursing profession. The trial resulted in convictions on multiple counts of capital offense. Given the nature of the crimes, the betrayal of trust, the vulnerability of the victims, the calculated nature of the acts, the state pursued the harshest penalties available. In 2006, Jackson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Her nursing license was revoked, her freedom taken away permanently, and her name added to the list of healthcare workers who'd betrayed their profession in the most fundamental way. Jackson's case fits into a particularly disturbing category of criminal, the healthcare serial killer, sometimes referred to as angels of death. These are medical professionals who use their positions to harm patients. They're especially difficult to detect because deaths in healthcare settings aren't always unexpected, and the perpetrators have detailed knowledge of how to commit their crimes without immediately raising suspicion. Jackson's case prompted hospitals across the country to review their monitoring procedures, to implement better safeguards, and to train staff to recognize patterns that might indicate foul play. Today, Vicki Dawn Jackson remains in prison, a cautionary tale about how trust can be weaponized by those who are supposed to heal. Her victims entered the hospital hoping to get better, trusting that the nurses caring for them had their best interests at heart. Instead, they encountered a predator in scrubs, someone who took advantage of their vulnerability in the most unforgivable way possible. Number 6. John Edward Robinson Sr. The internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s was still relatively new to most people. Chat rooms were popular gathering places where people could connect, share interests, and form relationships. For many, it was an exciting frontier. But like any new technology, it also created opportunities for predators. John Edward Robinson Sr. recognized those opportunities, and he became one of the first widely publicized serial killers to use the internet as a hunting ground. Robinson seemed like a respectable businessman and family man on the surface. Born in 1943, he lived in the Kansas City area, had a wife and children, and presented himself as successful and trustworthy. He claimed to have degrees he'd never earned and jobs he'd never held. But this was all a carefully constructed facade. Behind the scenes, Robinson was deeply involved in criminal activities, including fraud, embezzlement, and eventually taking lives. He was skilled at manipulation, at presenting different faces to different people, at exploiting trust for his own gain. He'd been in trouble with the law multiple times before, serving time for fraud and theft, but he always managed to rebuild his reputation. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing into 2000, Robinson used personal ads and later internet chat rooms to lure victims. He would pose as a successful businessman or talent scout, promising opportunities, relationships, or financial support. He advertised himself in BDSM chat rooms, presenting himself as someone interested in those relationships. His victims were often women who were vulnerable in some way, maybe going through financial difficulties, maybe struggling with relationships, maybe just looking for connection. Robinson knew how to identify vulnerability and exploit it. The activities connected to Robinson spanned years, but it was in 2000 that the full extent of his crimes finally came to light. In June 2000, police executed search warrants on properties associated with Robinson. What they found was beyond horrifying. On a rural property in Kansas, investigators discovered two 55-gallon drums. Inside those drums were the remains of two women. On another property in Missouri, at a storage facility, 3 more bodies were found in similar barrels. 5 victims, their bodies hidden away like unwanted cargo, each one representing a life stolen by Robinson's deception and violence. The investigation revealed that Robinson had been using the internet to meet women, promising them various opportunities, then luring them to isolated locations. In some cases, he continued to access the victims' financial accounts after their deaths, stealing their money and identities. He forged letters to their families explaining why they'd gone away. He was methodical, careful, and for years, he got away with it. But technology that had helped him find victims also left digital trails. Investigators were able to trace his online communications, his email accounts, his chat room activity. The digital evidence, combined with the physical remains found on his properties, built an overwhelming case. The victims included women like Suzette Trutin and Isabella Lewicka, young women who'd believed Robinson's promises about jobs and opportunities. Beverly Bonner, a former prison librarian who'd had an affair with Robinson while he was incarcerated, also became a victim. The discoveries in 2000 also led investigators to connect Robinson to earlier disappearances from the 1980s, suggesting his violent behavior had been going on for nearly 2 decades. The trial was extensive, covering multiple charges across different time periods. The prosecution presented evidence of Robinson's online activities, his financial crimes, and most damningly, the remains of his victims. The defense attempted to challenge the evidence, to suggest alternative explanations, but there was simply too much proof. The DNA evidence, the digital records, the testimony of women who'd interacted with Robinson online but escaped becoming victims. It all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. John Edward Robinson Sr. was convicted on multiple counts. Given the nature and number of his crimes, he was sentenced to death in Kansas. He currently sits on death row, where he's remained for over 2 decades as appeals slowly work their way through the legal system. His case has been studied extensively by law enforcement, psychologists, and internet safety advocates. He represents a crucial lesson in the early days of online interaction. Not everyone online is who they claim to be, and the promises made in chat rooms can lead to real-world danger. Robinson's victims trusted him. They believed his promises, his persona, his carefully crafted lies, and that trust cost them everything. Number 7. Derek Todd Lee, Louisiana in the early 2000s was gripped by fear. Women were disappearing from Baton Rouge and surrounding areas, and investigators were racing to find the person responsible before more lives were lost. The community was on edge, wondering who might be next, wondering if the person they passed on the street could be a killer. And all the while, Derek Todd Lee was hiding in plain sight, living what appeared to be a normal life while committing acts that would make him one of Louisiana's most notorious serial killers. Derek Todd Lee was born in 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana. He grew up in the area, married young, and had children. To his neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed like an ordinary guy, someone who worked various jobs, lived in the community, raised a family. But there were warning signs that suggested something darker beneath the surface. Lee had a history of peeping Tom incidents and harassment complaints. He'd been accused of stalking women. But these incidents were treated as minor offenses, not as red flags of someone capable of extreme violence. The series of events that would define Lee's legacy began in the late 1990s and escalated dramatically in the years that followed. Between 1998 and 2003, multiple women in the Baton Rouge area were attacked in their homes. The victims were often young women living alone or in vulnerable situations. The attacks showed increasing brutality over time, suggesting someone who was becoming bolder and more confident in their crimes. By 2000, the pattern was undeniable. Someone was systematically targeting women in the area. The investigation was massive and complex. Multiple law enforcement agencies coordinated efforts, analyzing crime scenes, collecting DNA evidence, Interviewing potential witnesses. The media coverage was intense, with warnings issued to women about taking precautions. The fear was palpable. Women changed their routines, installed additional security measures, and looked over their shoulders constantly. The pressure on law enforcement to solve the cases was enormous. One of the key challenges in the investigation was that initially, investigators were looking for the wrong person. A serial killer task force had been formed, but early profiling suggested they were looking for a white male. This led them to focus on suspects who didn't match Lee's description. Meanwhile, Lee continued his activities, taking advantage of the misdirection to remain undetected. The breakthrough came through DNA evidence. As forensic technology improved and DNA databases expanded, investigators were able to collect and analyze biological evidence from crime scenes with greater precision. In 2003, DNA evidence finally connected Lee to multiple crime scenes. The evidence was unmistakable. The same genetic profile appeared at multiple locations where women had been attacked. When investigators took a closer look at Derek Todd Lee, they realized he'd been hiding in plain sight all along. Lee was arrested in May 2003 in Atlanta, Georgia, where he'd fled after realizing police were closing in. The arrest ended a reign of terror that had lasted years. Once in custody, Lee became the subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators worked to connect him to all the unsolved cases that matched his pattern. DNA evidence linked him definitively to several victims, including Geraldine DeSoto, Charlotte Murray Pace, Trinisha Dene Kalam, and others. While his activities had begun earlier, the year 2000 fell squarely in the middle of his active period. The trials began in 2004. Lee was prosecuted in multiple jurisdictions for different victims. The prosecution presented overwhelming DNA evidence, along with testimony from survivors who'd managed to escape. In each case, the evidence was damning. Lee's DNA was found at crime scenes. His behavior matched the pattern of attacks, and there were no alternative explanations that made sense. The defense tried to challenge the DNA evidence and question collection procedures, but the science was sound. Derek Todd Lee was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to death. The verdict brought some measure of closure to the families of his victims, though nothing could bring back the women he'd taken. Lee's case demonstrated both the power of DNA evidence in solving serial crimes and the danger of relying too heavily on profiling that might lead investigators in the wrong direction. Lee died in 2016 while on death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary, not from execution, but from natural causes, heart disease. His death meant he never faced the full consequences of his actions in the execution chamber, but it also meant his reign of terror was finally, definitively over. His case remains a subject of study for law enforcement professionals, particularly regarding the importance of keeping an open mind during investigations and not letting preconceived notions about what a killer should look like prevent the pursuit of justice. Number 8. Zhangjun criminal cases in China don't always receive the same international attention as those in Western countries, but that doesn't make them any less significant or disturbing. Zhangjun's case stands as one of the most shocking in Chinese criminal history, a story of robbery, violence, and systematic cruelty that spanned multiple provinces and left a trail of devastation across the country. Zhangjun was born in 1966 in Hunan Province, China. Details about his early life remain somewhat limited in Western sources, but what's known paints a picture of someone who descended into increasingly serious criminal behavior. By the late 1990s, Zhang had assembled a gang of accomplices and was operating as a roving criminal enterprise. This wasn't a disorganized group of opportunistic criminals. This was a coordinated operation with Zhang at its center, planning and executing carefully calculated crimes across multiple regions. The criminal activities attributed to Zhang and his gang began in the late 1990s and continued into 2000. The gang specialized in armed robberies, but their methods were particularly brutal. They would target financial institutions, businesses, and wealthy individuals, using extreme violence to accomplish their goals. The gang's approach was to overwhelm their targets with force, leaving no witnesses who might identify them later. This meant that their robberies often turned deadly, with victims losing their lives during the commission of these crimes. Between 1999 and 2000, Zhang's gang is believed to have been responsible for numerous serious incidents across several provinces, including Hunan, Chongqing, Sichuan, Hubei, and Henan. The body count associated with their criminal spree is staggering. Various sources attribute dozens of deaths to Zhang and his accomplices. Some estimates place the number of lives taken as high as 28. Each incident followed a similar pattern. The gang would arrive, prepared for violence, commit their robbery, and eliminate anyone who might identify them. The investigation into these crimes was complex because of the geographic spread. Different provinces had different law enforcement agencies, and coordinating information across these boundaries took time. But as the body count rose and the pattern became clearer, Chinese authorities launched a massive manhunt. Zhang Jun and his gang were designated priority targets, with resources devoted to tracking their movements and predicting where they might strike next. The crimes committed by Zhang's gang terrorized the regions where they operated. Business owners lived in fear. Financial institutions increased security measures, and the public demanded action from law enforcement. The pressure on police to capture the gang was immense. This wasn't just about property crime. This was about stopping a group that was willing to take lives without hesitation to accomplish their goals. The breakthrough came in 2000, when coordinated police efforts finally caught up with members of the gang. Zhang Jun was apprehended along with several accomplices. The arrests were the result of extensive investigative work, tracking the gang's movements, analyzing patterns in their crimes, and following leads from witnesses who'd seen the perpetrators. Once in custody, the evidence against Zhang and his associates was overwhelming. Forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and confessions from gang members painted a clear picture of the crimes committed. The Chinese legal system moved swiftly. Zhang Jun and his accomplices faced trial in 2000, charged with multiple counts including robbery, intentional harm resulting in death, and other serious offenses. The prosecution presented evidence of the gang's systematic approach to violence, the planning that went into their crimes, and the devastating impact on victims and their families. The defense had little room to maneuver. The evidence was clear, and multiple members of the gang corroborated the key facts. The verdicts came down hard. Zhang Jun was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to death, along with several of his key accomplices. In China's legal system, death penalty cases move more quickly than in many Western countries, particularly for crimes involving multiple victims. Zhang Jun was executed in 2000, bringing a swift end to his criminal career and providing a measure of justice for his numerous victims. Zhang's case highlights several aspects of serious crime in China that differ from Western contexts. The speed of the legal process, the coordinated response across provincial boundaries, and the ultimate punishment reflect a different approach to criminal justice. But the fundamental story remains the same. A violent criminal preyed on innocent people. Law enforcement worked to stop him, and justice was ultimately served. The families of Zhang's victims could at least take comfort in knowing that he would never harm anyone else, though nothing could undo the damage he'd caused or bring back the lives he'd taken. Number 9. Manuel Octavio Bermudez, Colombia, has a dark history with violent crime, from drug cartels to guerrilla movements to individual predators who've terrorized communities. Among these, Manuel Octavio Bermudez stands out as one of the most disturbing, a killer whose crimes earned him a nickname that still sends chills through those familiar with his case: the Monster of the Cane Fields. Manuel Octavio Bermudez Castillo was born in 1972 in Valle del Cauca, Colombia. This is a region known for its sugarcane fields, vast agricultural areas where the tall plants provide cover and isolation. It's also a region that has struggled with poverty, displacement, and violence. Bermudez grew up in this environment, though details about his early life remain scarce in publicly available records. What's known is that by his late 20s, he'd become one of Colombia's most wanted criminals. The criminal activities attributed to Bermudez occurred primarily between 1999 and 2000, though some sources suggest his violence may have started earlier. His victims were primarily young boys and adolescents, often from vulnerable backgrounds: street children, runaways, or young people from impoverished families. These were victims who might not be immediately missed, whose disappearances might not trigger instant alarm from authorities. Bermudez exploited this vulnerability systematically. His method involved luring young victims to isolated locations, often the sugarcane fields that gave him his nickname. The tall canes provided perfect cover. You could be mere feet from a road or pathway and be completely hidden from view. Bermudez would bring victims to these locations under various pretenses, then commit horrific acts of violence. The bodies of his victims were often found in the cane fields, sometimes discovered by workers during harvest, sometimes stumbled upon by people passing through the area. The investigation into Bermudez's crimes was hampered by several factors. Colombia, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was dealing with widespread violence from multiple sources. Resources were stretched thin, and crimes against marginalized youth sometimes received less attention than other cases. Additionally, the geographic spread of the crimes and the isolated locations where bodies were found made it difficult to connect them to a single perpetrator initially. But as the body count rose and patterns emerged, law enforcement began to focus their attention. Multiple young victims, similar circumstances, crimes occurring in the same general region. It suggested a serial offender. Colombian authorities launched an investigation, coordinating between different municipalities and departments. They interviewed witnesses, examined crime scenes, and slowly built a profile of the person they were seeking. The breakthrough came when investigators connected Bermudez to several of the crimes through witness testimony and physical evidence. People who'd seen him with victims before they disappeared came forward. Evidence from crime scenes pointed toward a single perpetrator. When authorities arrested Bermudez in 2000, the pieces of the puzzle finally came together. Under interrogation, Bermudez confessed to multiple instances of violence against young victims. The exact number remains disputed, with some sources claiming over 30 victims, though the officially confirmed count is lower. The legal proceedings against Bermudez moved through Colombia's justice system. He was charged with multiple counts related to his crimes against young victims. The prosecution presented testimony from witnesses, forensic evidence from crime scenes, and Bermudez's own confessions. The defense had little ground to stand on. The evidence was substantial, and Bermudez himself had admitted to the crimes. Bermudez was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Colombia's legal system has specific provisions for crimes against minors, and Bermudez faced the maximum sentences available. He was sent to prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life, isolated from society and unable to harm any more victims. The case of Manuel Octavio Bermudez raises uncomfortable questions about how societies protect their most vulnerable members. The young victims he targeted were often invisible to mainstream society, living on the streets, disconnected from family support systems, struggling to survive day to day. Their vulnerability made them easy targets for a predator like Bermudez. His case prompted discussions in Colombia about how to better protect at-risk youth, how to ensure that crimes against marginalized populations receive proper attention from law enforcement, and how to identify and stop predators before they can claim multiple victims. Today, Bermudez remains imprisoned, his name synonymous with one of Colombia's darkest criminal cases. The sugarcane fields where he committed his crimes still stand, a reminder of how ordinary landscapes can become scenes of extraordinary horror when a predator finds vulnerable victims with nowhere to turn. Number 10. Anthony Hardy London, at the turn of the millennium, was a massive, sprawling city where millions of people lived, worked, and sometimes disappeared without anyone noticing. In the midst of this urban anonymity, Anthony Hardy was living a secret double life. To some, he was just another middle-aged man, unremarkable and easy to overlook. But behind closed doors, he was committing acts so disturbing that they would earn him a place among Britain's most notorious criminals. Anthony Hardy was born in 1951 in Burton upon Trent, England. He'd had what appeared to be a normal life for many years. He was married, had children, and worked as an engineer. By all outward appearances, he was a respectable member of society. But his marriage fell apart, and by the late 1990s, Hardy was living alone in North London. His mental health had deteriorated, and he'd been diagnosed with various conditions, though he often refused treatment. Neighbors in his building found him odd, sometimes troubling, but nobody suspected the full extent of what he was capable of. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in January 2002, when a homeless person discovered body parts in a bin near Hardy's residence. The discovery was shocking. These weren't complete bodies, but dismembered remains, discarded like trash. Police launched an immediate investigation, and the trail led them to Hardy's door. When officers searched his flat, they found the remains of two women. The scene was nightmarish. Body parts had been carefully dismembered and stored, showing a level of calculation that went beyond simple violence. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing. This wasn't Hardy's first time. Going back through records and re-examining earlier cases, investigators found that Hardy had likely been active for longer than initially thought. In 2000, police had actually been called to Hardy's flat after a locked door was forced open, revealing a woman who died inside. At the time, Hardy claimed she died during consensual activity, and shockingly, he wasn't charged. A pathologist initially determined the death was from natural causes, and Hardy walked free. It was a decision that would haunt investigators, because it meant Hardy had continued his activities for nearly 2 more years before being stopped. The victims discovered in 2002 were identified as Elizabeth Valad and Bridget McLennan, both women who'd been living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. They were people who might not be immediately missed, whose absence didn't trigger immediate alarm. Hardy had exploited that vulnerability, and investigators now believe that the woman who died in his flat in 2000, Sally White, had also been his victim, that the initial determination of natural causes had been wrong. The investigation into Hardy was extensive. Forensic teams processed his flat, finding evidence that confirmed the worst fears of investigators. Hardy had not only taken these women's lives, but had dismembered their bodies, keeping body parts in his residence. The level of calculated planning and the condition of the remains suggested someone who was comfortable with this process, who'd done it before. When Hardy was arrested and charged, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence, testimony about the victim's last known whereabouts, and the undeniable physical evidence found in Hardy's flat. The defense attempted to argue mental illness, suggesting Hardy wasn't fully responsible for his actions due to his psychological conditions. It's true that Hardy had documented mental health issues, but the prosecution argued that the calculated nature of his crimes, the dismemberment, the disposal attempts, the efforts to avoid detection, showed someone who understood what he was doing. In November 2003, Anthony Hardy pleaded guilty to 3 counts of taking lives, including the 2 women found in 2002 and Sally White from 2000. The guilty plea meant there was no trial, but it also meant definitive acknowledgement of his crimes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he never be released. The judge determined that Hardy posed too great a risk to ever return to society. Anthony Hardy remains imprisoned today, and he will almost certainly die behind bars. His case became known as the Camden Ripper case, named after the area of London where he'd lived and committed his crimes. It serves as a troubling reminder of how someone can hide violent behavior in a massive city, how vulnerable populations are particularly at risk from predators, and how mistakes in investigation, like the initial determination that Sally White's death was natural, can allow dangerous individuals to continue harming others. The case also prompted serious questions about how mental health issues intersect with criminal behavior, about whether warning signs had been missed, and about how society protects people whose lifestyles make them vulnerable to exploitation. Hardy's victims deserved better. Better protection, better attention when they went missing, better justice. And while Hardy was eventually caught and punished, the damage he caused can never be undone.